This hunger for becoming and this coming into existence is a move with consequences. It's funny, anytime I'm about to start talking about becoming, I notice the becoming. So it's this, it doesn't stop me, like I can be speaking and have this sense of, it's like attention wants to land on things and claim them, right? So I see all these faces and there's this delight. And with the delight, I want to sort of go swimming in, just take a nice warm swim. And there's no problem with that, really, except that it's alluring, So there's this mindfulness that knows this happening. So I don't quite fall in. So I can remain with you in this way, knowing experience. And of course, it would be a natural thing if, as you hear these words from me, you're watching that process in yourself, right? So maybe there's some delight or curiosity in my words, and something wants to just sort of sit back and take a ride on the self boat. It's like, okay, let's go. Let's have this little self. So here we are together, and we can go towards that kind of selfing and the delight in it. We can enjoy it. I'm not calling it evil or anything, but to be gratified by that is to kind of get sucked in, And of course, one of the repeated teachings of the Buddha is on gratification, to name that, say, yeah, it's nice. Gratification, a temporary satisfaction. This is nice. But then the next teaching in that sequence, of course, is the danger. It's like, then the mind kind of gives up in it, and the classical danger there or difficulty is that there will be a kind of discontent, always on the edge. When will it end? Or when it ends, unhappy, right? And then the obvious solution to the issue is sort of not taking refuge in it, not getting lost in it to begin with, which is what we're doing now. So we're being pretty skillful, don't you think? We can pat ourselves on the back and say, oh, wait a minute. No, the self is becoming that patting on the back. So, so the hungering to become is like always there, sort of like I live in an area, I live on an island, in an area with a lot of other islands, far, far northwest United States. And the tide is always moving one way or another. And because of all these islands, there's all these currents. Some of them are quite benign, no problem. Some of them get pretty strong when something funnels in, So you're always in a current one way or another. That's like us, We're always in some kind of current of self. But with a kind of ongoing practice, not only of mindfulness, because our practice here, like even as I'm speaking and you're listening now, is a practice of right view, right? We're practicing right view, wise understanding right now with words. And it points the mind, like as I speak, as you listen right now, pointing the mind, is there self-making? What does it feel like? What does it look like? Investigating for ourselves, because my words by themselves are just words, they're empty. But when it goes into your heart, into your thinking mind, into your body, and you investigate and you check it out in experience, it's not just with the intellect, you're checking it out in your own body, in your own sort of mind states, the chitta, the sense of the mind. Then it's actually begins to restructure. Do you see what I'm saying? You see what I'm saying? That this restructuring is happening now as we speak together. So this is a practice. And this practice of wise understanding is right now aiming towards relinquishment. It's a kind of a direction of these words, an intention of these words is towards this letting go of that fast current of self-making, the bhava tanha. Does that make sense to you? And do you feel it? Do you feel something of it now as I speak? Because that's what we're doing. This is real practice. We can begin with a kind of a diligence or sincerity to notice this anytime at all. I want to repeat that. We can notice this anytime at all. And why don't we? It's easy not to. It's sort of, we go off not just in the pleasure of those currents, but we get lost in the sorrow. We get lost in the anguish also. We fall in to the anguish. See what I'm saying? That moment of becoming is a moment also of avidya, of ignorance. So we blank out. And then, of course, we don't notice. But we can notice anytime. And the noticing is enough. If we expect, I'm going to be a successful Buddhist or something, then this is going to just totally stop happening. Well, good luck. I wouldn't be so hard on yourself to think that that's the only measure of progress, because in the classical knowledge, classical Buddhist psychology, this selfing process of all the different places of unskillfulness and all the kind of refinement of the heart that's possible, this is the last thing to let go. So, no big deal, no judgment, not even a problem, because as soon as you see it, you're actually in good practice, right? So it's good to remember that. It's good to I suppose be encouraged or let it move you towards patience and continued interest in the human situation, in your own situation. And of course, with the recognition that everybody you know is experiencing the same situation. Like, look at all these faces here. We're all in the same boat. Really good to remember that. Especially, when you have difficulty with someone. It's very hard to remember that, because the self wants to take rise in its own justification, in its rightness. So think about that for a moment. How strong is your feeling of self when you're right and they are wrong? When they are hurting you, when they are in your way, when that organization, that human being, that group, that anything is confronting, and then I become in opposition to that. I had a someone very dear in my life who defined herself in opposition. That was her identity. It's kind of a victim, not just the anger. There was the anger, but there was also the victim identity. And the suffering in that is, continuous. And we all have our version of that. It's a standard formula, really. In fact, there's, what is it? The victim, rescuer, persecutor triangle or something. Someone knows about that. One of you definitely knows about that. But there's all kinds of systemic ways of speaking. And from a Buddhist standpoint, to look at the hungers underneath that points also to the release. That's the gateway out of that kind of triangle or those kinds of relationships. It's not fixing that person or even fixing yourself. It's coming to know with kind awareness the nature of becoming, a bhava, this bhava tanha, hunger for becoming, lust, thirst, longing to stabilize the self, even if we have to stabilize the self in pain, in opposition, in difficulty. I'd like to repeat that. I hope that's okay. Even if we have to stabilize the self in pain, this is what we will do to stabilize the self. So we began to talk a little bit about last week about this, sense of the complexity of lived experience, the organism, the neural hormonal self, and the organism just provide, gripping on to the natural outflows of organismic life, of the life of the body mind, namarupa in Pali. And perhaps now we can begin to, see what we've learned from experience. And so let me ask you this. Did any of you actually follow through and try out the homework, if you will, the home practice assignment I offered? And let me start with this one. The delight or non-delight in pleasant sensations. Did anyone actually look at pleasant sensations without delight? Ah, good, Susie. And is there anything that you would say about that, Susie? Or you don't have to, but you'd have to unmute if you do.
So with a friend who I hadn't seen for a long time, and a lot of appreciation from her. It felt very personal, very, very yummy, and just felt the pleasant. And there wasn't a pushing away of the pleasant, but there was a, um, I don't know whether I would call it a feeling or an insight, but anyway, there was a, ooh, this is so delicious. I could, I could get stuck here.
And did you not? Could you perch there and not get stuck? That's
I'm
that's the
not promising forever with that, but it felt like,
uh-huh.
yeah, it was just that this feels good.
It's sort of like what I really like in your description is that you're right at the edge and you could just fall in. You could just slip in like to a warm pool, right? Ah, ah, but you didn't.
And then
Mm.
now there's like, there can be an identification with the one who didn't.
Oh yeah, of course. No,
The
we're always going to do that.
pleasantness of hearing that from you.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Of course, we're always going to do that. That's the thing. It's just like, you know, one of the teachings of the Buddha that's really so simple and so powerful is on the importance or the strength, the efficacy of diligence, of continuity, of it talks about like an elephant's footprint. It's the largest of the animal's feet, and all the other animals' feet would fit inside it. You take any animal, it's going to be smaller. And diligence is like that. So, what we're talking about is diligence because this thirsting to become is always going to be there, right? So, how do we live that? Is that a harsh taskmaster? Someone with a whip and judgment? Someone with anger and self hatred, self judgment? Would you think that that would be sustainable? Could you hold that up? I suspect not. But what about kindness? What about interest? What about a kind of a sense of uh, being sustained or carried in the ongoing intention of your life towards release, right? In other words, it's not just in that moment, how am I in relationship to falling into pleasure or hatred, to lust or hatred? It's not just in that moment, but is there a movement in my life? Is there an arc in my life? It's not just the instant. Do you understand what I'm saying? Because it ties into our practice here together right now. If your mind, if your heart understands what I'm saying and is somehow moved by it, touched, then there's a orienting in this direction because you sense the sweetness. You sense the, oh, you mean it's possible to not be a slave of becoming. It's a stunning vision. And when we sense it, we turn towards it like a bee going towards the flower with the pollen. Ah, just like that, you know? And then even if in a moment mindfulness is weak, it's going to happen, right? We're still carried by a different kind of current instead of being carried by the current of becoming, of slavish self making. we're carried by a current of release. That's where we sense the sweetness. And so our practice together here is oriented that way. So let's take that as our first dialogue practice together. So you're going to be invited or kind of gathered into groups of 2 in just a moment. And we'll just practice for 15 minutes. That would be plenty for this. Because what I'm going to invite you to do with your meditation partner is, in your pause, to sense into this aspect of life direction. Is there an inclination? Is there a sense of possibility of the mind, of the heart, of the life inclining towards relinquishment, towards release, towards being out of that current of becoming? And you can also perhaps sense the current of becoming and how you do slip into that. But really look also at the nod, the sense of my mind, my heart, my life going in that way. Okay? So in 14 minutes, I think, you'll get the 1 minute signal. And Jason and Thomas, do your magic, and I'll see all of you in just a little bit. Remember to support yourself with pause, relax, and even with your screen open. Okay? I hope that was beneficial practice for you. So I'd like to now dive a little bit deeper into the kind of the moment by moment process of contact with the world, and then how perception arises, and that the self is right, virtually inherent within those perceptions. There's a teaching where this is really concisely and clearly laid out. In fact, it was so concise that part of the story of this discourse that I'm going to quote from is the Buddha sitting there, and there's all these monks sitting with him. You know, it's one of these typical scenarios in which these teachings were offered. But in this particular teaching, the Buddha gives this very, very short, pithy teaching that I'm going to read to you now, and then just gets up and goes back to his hut. And everybody's sitting there like, what? I don't understand that. And there is another senior disciple there, Mahakachana, and they say to him, hey, maybe you could explain this to us. And he says, hey, guys, The Buddha was right here. He's the one that knows. You should have asked him. And they said, oh, no, please, please, please. We don't want to trouble you, but we really want to understand this. He said, okay, look, I'll kind of unpack it for you. And he unpacks it, and I'm going to read you little pieces of that as well. And then he said, but you really should check it out with the Buddha, right? Because no one really wants to pretend to be what they're not. And so they check it out with the Buddha. And of course, as these things often go, yeah, that's exactly what I meant. Good job. So it's got a human story behind it that I also find charming. But the teaching itself is very pithy, very dense. So bring yourself into this moment and let it in, is my suggestion to you. So what they're asking about is, what is this teaching by which one does not quarrel with anyone in the world? Because that was the kind of like, everybody's taking a position, everybody's got a stance. What are you saying that you've got this teaching where there's no quarreling? And here's the reply. Bhikkhus, as to the source through which perceptions and notions tinged by mental proliferation beset a person, if nothing is found there to delight in, welcome, and hold to, this is the end of the underlying tendency to lust, the underlying tendency to aversion, of the underlying tendency to views, of the underlying tendency to doubt, of the underlying tendency to conceit, of the underlying tendency to desire for being, of the underlying tendency to ignorance. This is the end of resorting to rods and weapons, of quarrels, brawls, disputes, recrimination, malice, and false speech. Here, these evil, unwholesome states cease without remainder. So let me go right back to the kernel of that. Ready? As to the source through which perceptions and notions tinged by mental proliferation beset a person, here's the key. If nothing is found there to delight in, welcome, and hold to, this is the end of the underlying tendency to this whole shooting match, to all of it. That's it. It's just one little piece, one little unhooking. Now this unpacking of it is also really helpful. Dependent on the eye and forms, and then he's going to go, Mahakachana is going to go into on the ear and sounds and the body and touches. Okay, so all of this, remember last week we talked about this, the sense bases, and one of the ways I framed the sense bases, what is this translation from the physical sensed world, the world of molecules and the world of pressure and so on, into a signal, if you will, in modern, kind of psychophysiological terms, into a experienceable stream of mental phenomena, right? That's what's happening at the senses, even as you and I speak and listen together right now. There's this translation of, you might say, physical phenomena to mental. And that's what we're experiencing as the world. So in this example, it begins with just the visual part. Depending on the eye and forms, eye consciousness arises. So seeing comes up. And the meeting of the three is contact. Okay, so in this contact, there's feeling. So there's pleasant and unpleasant experience dependent upon this contact. Okay, so that's where we go from the kind of the physical sensing to the mental or body-mind experience, in this case of seeing. And it's pleasant, unpleasant, or it's neutral. But there is something there. Well, and here we go. Now we take off, right? So hold on to your saddle, as they say. What one feels, that one perceives. So it's not just pleasant or unpleasant, but there's also object formation, qualities, colors, all of those aspects that fall under sanya, or perception. What one perceives, this is so key. What one perceives, one thinks about. Do you see how we've gone from the world out there, from just raw contact, to feeling, perception, what one perceives, one thinks about. So now something is set in motion. What one thinks about, that one mentally proliferates. Now, maybe you don't do that. I do. Let me tell you, oh, yeah, that is a nice tree. Looks like spring it's got little tips and it's, and it's, that tree's somehow built in, it's in my yard and it's, I find it beautiful, very innocuous little proliferation. But what about if I look at one of you and I have all my proliferations about you, right? And you about me and us together as a group and all those people who don't know the Dhamma, we can proliferate about them, just go on forever. Start anywhere and go forever in any direction. Okay, so what one thinks about, that one mentally proliferates. With what one has mentally proliferated as the source, and this is a key, perceptions and notions tinged by mental proliferation beset a person with respect to past, future, and present forms cognizable by the eye and the ear and so on. In other words, in the very instant of this feeling, perception, thinking proliferation, the perceptions themselves are tinged by the mind. The totality of our experience is instantly interpreting the world according to our constructed framework. Whoa, that sounds a little bit slippery to me, little bit dangerous. So I'm jumping forward just a little bit. So to give you another, because there's another angle that Mahakachana unpacks that's really also helpful. Okay. So when there's I and form and I consciousness, it's possible to point out the manifestation of contact. That's where we say we're experiencing the world, right? Where sensation is happening and feeling is dependent upon that contact happening and so on. So we're at the same place we were before. When there's the manifestation of contact, it's possible to point out the manifestation of feeling. Got that? When there's the manifestation of feeling, we have the manifestation of perception. We had that. Manifestation of perception, the manifestation of thinking. When there's thinking, point out the manifestation of, here we go, a little different angle, but an important one, especially for our talk here. It's possible to point out the manifestation of becoming that's beset by perceptions and notions that are tinged by that proliferation. So let me touch that again in just my words right here. So now we're in contact with the world, just like you and I are in contact now with language and seeing and computer screens and all of this. So there's this experience. It's not somewhere else. It's not some austere other thing. It's just life. So here we are with life. And there's the perceptions and the thinking and the proliferation. And now what we're seeing is with the manifestation of the perception, it's possible to point out the thinking, the manifestation of thinking, point out the manifestation of becoming that's beset by perceptions and notions that are tinged by the mental proliferation. That means that the becoming process, inherent in it, is the proliferations of the mind. So the way we perceive the world and experience this is real is all colored by our own mental proliferations. I mean, this is sort of in total agreement with contemporary cognitive science and studies of human perception. But I don't want to I don't want to try and take a validity in modern science. Just want to point that out to you, where the only real place of validity in these teachings is your experience. That's what matters. And that's why you observe. And that's why you meditate. And that's why we meditate together, because we can keep turning each other, as we are right now with my speaking, towards these aspects of experience that if we just sit by ourselves, very easy to just go off into the proliferation itself, to lose track. But we ground each other in this sense of becoming that's linked right into this moment of contact and the proliferation. Do you see what I'm saying? So this gets to, I want to ask you, if you observed in the other home practice assignment that I offered, to observe the voice in your mind, to observe kind of just moment by moment, when you could, or when you thought of it, what the aspect of this proliferating process you actually picked up. Did anybody do that? I'm looking for some bobbing heads would help me. So if anybody would like to comment on that, I'll leave a little bit of space here, just any sense of that experience that you would share with your spiritual friends. Don't forget to unmute if you're going to speak. Okay, well then you're stuck with me. I noticed, because I'm fascinated by this stuff in my own, my own ignorance is just like, wow, it's amazing how ignorant I am. That as soon as that voice comes up, if there's not this like really steady sati, mindfulness, right? Like it has to precede it really, almost. Then immediately that voice feels like me. So the becoming is, just intimate with the proliferation itself. It's not like it doesn't feel like two separate things. The proliferation is the self, you might say. And sure enough, the self commenting on some bodily discomfort or pain or something like that, or situation that I don't like, because we've been talking about a lot about delight and the things we like. Let's also realize the same thing's happening in the things we don't like, right? So it's like, oh wow, don't like this, and the voice is saying that, and Like, I don't really want to be experiencing this again, and it just kind of mumbling to itself. And the mumbling is already like a self, like the perceptual process and the tinging. I want to read you that line again. The manifestate where there's the manifestation of perception, it's possible to point out the manifestation of thinking, right? You understand that. When there's the manifestation of thinking, it's possible to point out, in other words, then you'll notice the manifestation of becoming, right? That's beset by these perceptions and notions that are tinged by the proliferation itself. See that? That's exactly how I experience it. I mean, he names it much more clearly than this poor mind would necessarily be able to do. But you can do this. You can see this yourself. You can see it now. That's the beauty of it. It's timeless. It's not personal. And it's directly observable in your own experience. So what does this tell us in the way that this becoming grows around these feelings, these sensations, the becoming, the self grows around these perceptions? Those of you who have heard me teach or have studied yourself elsewhere, the khandhas or the aggregates, realize that this is another angle or a doorway into this Rupa Vedana Sanya Sankara Vijnana. These kind of 5 aspects of the human experience that you can just like look at, what am I experiencing now? And with that framework, you can parse out this integrated, multidimensional experience of living. And here we're beginning to see how that the selfing process is right integrated with that. Whenever there's this landing in it, this holding to it, and the proliferation happens, which sets this body-mind system in motion towards the self, which is a painful thing. It's a separating thing. It's a lonely place because it's inherently self-obsessed. It's not just flowing and available to others. It's self-obsessed. It's not always, self-obsession doesn't, by the way, necessarily mean that it's unkind or something like that, because there's also urges that are, from this self that are quite beautiful. The self that builds itself around service. It's very beautiful. So bringing together the wisdom with the love and compassion is a kind of a it's like I'm not a kayaker, but I have seen people who can steer their little boats well. And these currents we were talking about, the currents in the islands and the self and the pulling in all these directions, these can be steered and moved with kindness and care and altruism and generosity, but no steering. And then next thing you know, you're up against the rocks of anger and selfishness. So I want to talk a little bit about what this means what this can tell us about practice. And I don't think it's difficult for most of you to see how, if you practice, if you cultivate mindfulness, some degree of calming the body mind, some degree of concentration, investigation, and so on, that the ability to directly experience what we're talking about here increases. You understand what I'm saying? That just this stability of mind, the clarity of mind, and the training towards observing the process as it unfolds is something that will strengthen your capacity to see this whole process in motion. And that informal meditation practice, which is to say, whether it's insight dialogue practice together or individual silent practice, that the sense of dedication, of commitment to pausing, to seeing the moment in silence, to just knowing experience as it's rising and falling, and sort of becoming available, you might say, intimate with the body-mind process. You can see how that would, that capacity would increase and how it would be liberating in that sense, right? But that's not by any means the whole path. That's a really important piece of the path. But I want to touch a bigger sense of the totality of the path, which is our lives as human beings. And largely, that's how we live with others and how we engage with this process of, perception and proliferation and becoming and being tinged by all that proliferation into the delusion, into the ignorance. And I often come back to this discourse. It's called the Effacement Sutta. Effacement is a very obscure word, even for those for whom English is the first language. It refers to the erosion of the self, the wearing away of the self. That kind of has this sense of gradualness. It has this sense of a kind of a slow, repeated washing, wearing down of the stone that is the hard edges of becoming, of self-obsession, and so on. And interestingly enough, this discourse begins by speaking about the very refined meditation practice and experience of jhana, or absorption, or kind of the deep settling of the body-mind in stillness. And that even these highly refined jhanas are pleasant abiding here and now. They are not effacement. And effacement, the Buddha explains, should be practiced thus. A person given to cruelty has non-cruelty by which to avoid it. The one given to, other forms of immorality, and he goes over each of them: killing living beings, taking what is not given, the unwise engagement with sexuality, false speech, malicious speech. But then it kind of goes on with harsh speech and gossip and ill will, and then goes into the Eightfold Path. But then it gets so earthy that I want to share with you this sense of the path. So we got, wrong action. You can have right action by which to overcome it, livelihood, mindfulness, concentration, knowledge and deliverance. Then you got another couple of classical pieces, one given over to sloth and torpor, has freedom from sloth and torpor to lead upwards and out of that. Restlessness has non-restlessness. Now it starts to get pretty everyday human. Doubt and non-doubt, the state beyond doubt to lead beyond it. Anger, resentment, we have non-resentment as a practice. Contempt, we have non-contempt to work with. Insolence, we have non-insolence. Envy, avarice, fraud, deceit. These are practices, friends. That's why I'm going over this. We're all so familiar with mindfulness and concentration, and it's like that's the path. That's part of the path. I really want to convey this. This is like the totality of our lives. And this sense of human decency is just, to me, profoundly inspiring, very grounding. One given to obstinacy has non-obstinacy to lead upwards. Arrogance, being difficult to admonish. One given to making bad friends has making good friends by which to avoid it, to lead upwards. Negligence, you have diligence. Faithlessness, you have faith or confidence, trust in the process. Shamelessness, fearlessness of wrongdoing, like who cares if I do anything appropriate or inappropriate and hurt people. One given to little learning has great learning by which to move out through that. Laziness has the arousal of energy. And then we have mindfulness and unmindfulness. Lack of wisdom has the acquisition of wisdom. Well, thank you very much. And then the final one given to adhere to her own views, who holds on to them tenaciously and relinquishes them with difficulty, has non-adherence to her own views, not holding on to them tenaciously and relinquishing them easily, by which to avoid that or which to lead upward. So I didn't count them for you, but there were 44 of them. So I would like to offer us 10 minutes in dyads. And the contemplation is as follows. You're invited to, when you pause, touch into your sense of the path, right? Does the path look to you like mostly these meditation hall type practices? Or do you genuinely sense, or could you sense the power of a path that has this continuity because it's your personal, your personhood as it lives itself actually in this life? That's also the path, the whole bigger sense. And don't be afraid to touch the austere path, the stuff that looks Buddhist, but then see where it also feels into this greater sense. So just 10 minutes of practice. So let those pauses really support you. Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Thomas. Good. I want to ask how was your practice, but it's so impractical to get a response from everybody. I just want to acknowledge that that's how I'm feeling. I want to say, how are you doing? How's it going? Um, this sort of what one to many versus all together. It's, it's got its advantages and its difficulties. So I'd like to leave some space for questions, for inquiry together. But before doing so, I want to close with just a couple of things. I want to point where we're going, so that this week your home practice, your life practice, like this time, can inform it. Okay. Because of the way the human body mind grows and evolves, comes into the world and moves through the world. Our imprisonment and our possibility for non-imprisonment, for freedom, is completely saturated with the fact of our being relational beings. We were born into and we unfold moment by moment in the social matrix. There is no meaning to the individual self without understanding the relational self-forming process. And there's no meaning to suffering, to ignorance, to being locked in individually that does not include the suffering and the being locked in and the possibility of release in our relational totality. It just doesn't, you can't talk about it coherently, responsibly, and fully without that. And from the standpoint of where we've been touching into more this week with this process of perception and proliferation, the perception of a self is always a self in relation to others. There's no other aspect of it. For example, consider the things that you think about as defining your particular me: gender, age, the body shape, sexuality, being abled or non-abled or disabled. Those are just kind of inputs, notions that the self forms. And from the instant this brain in this particular life, this particular birth into this genetics is creating that sense of self, it's doing it in relationship to how others see this me, perceive this me, is then telling me how I perceive myself. What is the notion of gender if there's only one person on the planet? It's ridiculous. Because there's no other gender. There's no gender. Gender is a relational concept. So, being, let's say, the maleness or the manliness or the femaleness or the womanliness of gender and even of the biological sexuality. It's a relative thing. Likewise, skin color. It's like if you're the only person on the planet who wouldn't even notice your skin color, there's just this. But that's an absurdity. So all of these notions are notions of self and self in relation to others and self in a social context, all of it. And so we touched this kind of intimate moment of perception, tinged thinking, proliferation, and this coloring of perception, right? That's coming up from all of that constructed totality. That constructed totality is saturated inherently relationally. And then we move through the world and it's constantly formed and reformed in the actual relationships. But that's just triggering it. It's already there in that matrix, right? So I'd like to, as your home practice, invite you to begin to notice, and some of you I'm sure do this anyway, how is this sense of becoming arising relationally? When I'm with other people, it's going to be particularly strong because what happens is when we perceive another person, another human being, then all of the kind of, you might call them biosocial processes are set in motion that strengthen or that amplify the kind of becoming processes. The perceptual process is very strong because of the way that relational aspects of brain structure and hormone systems and so on. I mean, that's just a materialistic way of talking about a process that you can directly observe. But also notice this, please, this week when you're by yourself. And anytime there's any sense of success or failure or wanting, look for the relational aspect of the becoming in that, not just when you're with other people, okay? So if there's any questions, feel free to ask them. But I'd like to leave a few minutes to see if there's any observations about your practice or any questions you might have as we come towards our closing.
Gregory, I just have a clarification of words. I heard you talking about becoming and self-obsessed. Is that the same as identifying?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think each of these words has something slightly different to contribute, but they're essentially all the same process, which is the kind of the selfless, ongoing process of body-mind holding on, freezing its process nature. And in that frozenness, there's tension because the basic nature of body-mind is fluid and moving and without a center. So whenever there's this freezing of it, there's tension. And that tension is what's experienced as a self. And when that self process gets going, it begins to orient and to interpret the world according to whatever will make this self feel stable. So that's the identification process then drives the self-obsession. It's about stabilizing the me, pleasing the me, protecting the me. So.
Thanks a lot. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Gregory, so I have a question. This is Michael. I have a question, another word question. Mm-hmm. And you used the word tinged, which is a little bit new to me. Yeah. And from old habit patterns, I keep substituting the word tainted.
Ah,
And so if you could speak to that.
yeah. I'm going to answer in a technical way, Michael, because of just the way the discourses have been translated. This word tainted or taints is, I think, an unfortunate translation of the word asava, which is a kind of a basket, you might say, of the way I translate that word is intoxicants, or it's also translated as floods, things that flood the mind, or effluence, or and that the flooding of the mind, the intoxication of the, and I don't want to just say the mind, the intoxication of the body mind, in which there's a kind of a just like liquor intoxication, we just get completely lost in the becoming and in the the sensual experiences. We get lost, intoxicated by our ignorance, and move forward in the world in action, living out of this intoxicated state. But when that's translated as taints, and you could say that's tainted, that's, I prefer to sort of respect that technical aspect, because the asava, or these intoxications, is a very powerful teaching or concept. The tinging is, think of it more like a coloring of a perception. The perception is colored by the sense of self, and it's colored by our personal histories, so that, again, that let's say that cup is perceived as my cup, and it's perceived not just possessively, but any views I have, I hold on to those views, and a cup isn't so interesting there. But let's say me in my political views, or me in my Buddhist views, or me in some other way. That's a kind of a tinging, a coloring of the world, that it appears to be true. It appears to be this way, because I'm looking entirely through that tinged glass, if you will. So that's how I would look at those two words of tinged and taints or tainted. I see we're already a little bit over. So just if I could just offer us a minute or two more, see if anyone else has a final comment or question. Mm-hmm. You're muted.
Sorry.
Good.
Hi. First of all, thank you for your teaching. I would like to know if, please excuse my English, I'm from France.
It's perfect.
And I would like to know if, is there a way to hear to this teaching? Is there a recording somewhere? Because I need to hear it a second time, just to be sure I've understood everything.
Very good. Very good question. And in fact, others had asked me last time. Yes, this session is recorded. And when the people who organize such things so generously return from retreat in a few days, because almost everybody right now is on a retreat, the same retreat, actually. It will be posted somewhere at meta.org, or then I will ask them to put out an announcement to everybody who's registered for this, at least. And this, from the one from last week, it's not up yet because as soon as we had that talk last week, everybody went away the next day on retreat. So, but that won't be the case this time. So in a few days, you should be able to get it. So thank you for asking. That's very helpful. Yeah.
Thank you.
And actually, it's a good opportunity for me to also remind us that the people who are doing this and the resources by which they do it exist by way of each person's generosity. This stuff is not happening by magic elves. This is real human beings doing real work, paying for real web services and time. And there's no one at Meta just receiving a salary. But there are people who can only offer as much time as they do if there's some sort of support or stipend. Many of them receive none at all. Most receive nothing at all. But there's your basic operating opportunity, cost. I say this because you've heard me perhaps use this phrase of participatory intelligence, that we participate together, we engage as a community with the intelligence that knows that we create this beauty together. We are not passive recipients, that we have a sense of engagement and love, basically, or a sense of responsibility and care that comes out of a sense of the goodness that brings us together, the aspirations, and to actually take the move to offer the support through participating and helping things out, and through offering monetary support, which is how some of these things work. Some of these things can only function with money, is for us the move of intelligence, because it frees our own heart from the self-holding and protection and enters us into the flow together. It's a profoundly intelligent thing to do. It's a effective thing to do. It's Dana as liberating. Is that someone raising their hand to speak? Go ahead. Don't forget to unmute, though.
Regarding that piece that you just gave, could an address be included with that communication for Dana, or prefer not to do it over the internet?
Oh, I can check into that. Yeah, I can check into that. Thank you for asking. Sure. Yeah, so in closing, I hope that this has been useful, and that this next week is really that you take it into your lived life. It's just words, but the constructing mind can be deconstructed and reconstructed very powerfully through direct experience. So I hope that's happening for you in a good way. And I want to remember that our time together is dedicated to freeing the heart, and the heart freed is a caring heart. The free heart is a not self-obsessed heart. And so we can reflect for this moment in our closing on so many others who are with us in this dilemma, so many human beings, so many animals, insects, all these conscious beings experiencing difficulty and pain and confusion. May all of these beings, without exception, be free. Throughout the universe, just let the mind be without bounds. Let it expand and extend in all directions, touching and touched by all beings. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings find ease. May there be peace. May there be peace. May there be peace. Thank you, friends. Good to be with you. Really a privilege.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Visit meta.org to view all our online and in-person offerings.